Hi, and welcome to the first video in our PowerShell 7.2 for Intermediate tutorial series. So this series will have basically assumed that you've watched all the beginner videos because we're going to be incorporating a lot of what we learned in the beginner videos in these videos. Like in this video alone, we're going to be incorporating the pipeline. We're going to be incorporating the error handling with the try catch. So we're gonna be using arrays. We're gonna be using a bunch of different things. So make sure that you watch those beginner videos or that you have some PowerShell knowledge before watching this video because I won't be covering some of those smaller aspects. But today we're gonna be actually covering methods or functions. So we're gonna be covering how to create a function or commandlet or method in PowerShell. So we're going to see how we can give it the commandlet binding so we can run it as verbose or debug. We're going to be seeing how to add different parameters to our functions or commandlets. And we're going to be seeing the different blocks in a method or function in PowerShell. So let's actually go ahead and let's get started with that. So what we're going to be doing today is we are actually going to be creating a method that's going to create us some configuration files. This is just really random. These configuration files aren't going to be used for anything, but you could definitely develop this script to create maybe some configuration files to use with Ansible, or use maybe create some CSV files that other applications can use to automate your different systems. Or maybe it's just a script that creates files that other servers will look against that file and make sure that certain services are running or certain services are installed. And if they're not, then start the service or install the different role or service. So let's go ahead and let's get started with like the most basic version of this. So we're going to be doing it by hand, just creating the config file. And then we're going to be going ahead and converting that to a function or commandlet. So the first thing we really need to do, of course, is know where we want to put our configuration files. So let's go ahead and create a config path here. And we're going to name this, we're going to give it the value of our configuration folder here. I'm just going to be copying the path. And for me, that's just in my C folder, scripts, intermediate tutorials, and methods and configs. And then what we're going to go ahead and do as well is we're going to go ahead and try creating a configuration here. So all we really want to do is do a new dash item. So we're going to be creating a new item, and we're going to be passing it the path of config path here. And the only thing, I think that's going to actually work still. And then we're going to give it the name of, we're going to name our first config test config 1. And we're going to make that a .cfg file for a configuration file. And then the item type, we are going to say as a file. So let's go ahead and let's just run this and see what happens. So we get our output and we do get our configuration file there as well. Now the configuration file will be open. I'm not putting anything in these configuration files. We're just simply creating the files. If you guys wanted to add something to these files, that would definitely be an option as well with out file or export-csv, depending on, again, what type of config files you would want. But then if we wanted to do this again, we'd have to copy this line, and we have to modify this to create a new configuration file. And also now if we run this whole script again, we're going to get errors because the files already exist and we can't create them. So we'd have to eventually, if we have 100 or 150 different configurations, you could definitely see this script getting very, very long. Now we have seen, well, we could just simply put the names of the configs in an array and then do a for each loop and create them. But the only thing is, now if I add differences, since these are configs, what if it matters if it's a Windows config or if it's a Linux config? I'm not capturing this currently, so I wouldn't really know what is happening. So this is where methods would come in. It's just to really prevent you, once again, similar to for loops, or loops in general. Just avoid writing the same code over and over again. But with methods and functions and commandlets, you can actually put in some parameters that'll slightly change. Maybe it's not the same thing over and over again. Maybe there's some slight differences in the items that you're going to be creating. So let's go ahead and let's create our function. So at the top here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting the keyword function, and we're going to put a space here, and then we're going to create our function name. Now, again, in PowerShell, it's very important to always kind of keep it. It's not going to prevent you from not doing this, but it is definitely a good practice to do a verb-noun function or commandlet name. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our function as create configuration. It could be new configuration or set configuration, anything like that. As long as it's a verb noun and it kind of describes what it's doing pretty well, that should be fine. So we have our function, and we're going to just do a pair of open and closing curly brackets, and we have our function here. So if we actually just go ahead and we just do a write dash output, and we go, this is my function, and we write this out here. Let's just go ahead, let's erase this for now. We don't really need that. And all we're going to do is we're going to do a create dash configuration call at the bottom here. Let's go ahead and let's run this. We get this is my function. So we know that our function is working. We can call it successfully if we just run this line. We get this is my function. If I go in the console here and I do create configuration, we get this is my function. So everything is working very, very well here. So that is perfect. Let me just go ahead and delete these configs here. We don't want them anymore. All right, so once we have our basic function here, we know that it's working. Let's go ahead and let's add some of the commandlet options. Because right now, if I do create configuration, we're going to see nothing really pops up here. I can't put in any parameters. That's because we didn't make it accept any parameters. So let's go ahead and let's add some parameters here. So what we're going to do is an open and closing square bracket, and we're going to put commandlet binding open and close parentheses. And we're going to do an enter here, and then do a param open and close parentheses outside. So here we have our commandlet binding open and close parentheses inside square brackets, and then we have param here, and inside the param parentheses is where we're going to put our different parameters. So we know here when we did have the new item, one of the items that we wanted to know was the name of our configuration. So let's go ahead and let's put in a square bracket here, and let's do a parameter. And we're going to want to make this a mandatory parameter. So let's go ahead and let's put mandatory here. And then what we're going to need to do is press enter. And then we're going to want to enter the type of variable we are expecting. So we're going to expect a variable of string type. And our parameter name is going to be name. So let's go ahead and let's see here. And let's go ahead and let's change this output to creating configuration for, and then name. All right, so now that we have this here, so we have our little function. Right now, all it does is it takes in a name of a configuration, and we output to the screen, creating configuration for name. So if we go ahead and we run this now, and as you can notice, we didn't put the dash name, it auto prompts us for a name. So if I put test jacked here, we are going to see creating configuration for test jacked. But if I go ahead and do a dash, notice how we get all of these different options now. We get name, which is our parameter, but we also get verbose, debug, error action. These all come from this commandlet binding. If you don't put this commandlet binding and only put parameters, you're only going to get the parameters that you create. You're not going to get the default commandlet bindings. And I'm going to go and show you guys why the commandlet bindings could be very, very useful for your functions. And we're going to see that more towards the end of the video, but let's go ahead and let's put our parameter name here. And let's do a test config 1. So if we run this here, we get creating configuration for test config 1. So this is perfect. Our function is working. We're taking in a name. It's awesome. So let's go ahead and let's actually, instead of doing the write output or immediately after the write output, what we're going to do is we're just going to do a new -item, and we're going to do a path. And what we're going to do for now is we're just going to copy paste this path here, and we're going to do a name, and we're going to pass in our name. But what we're going to do is we're going to wrap it in double quotes. We're going to do a variable wrapper, and then we're going to put our name, and then we're going to put .cfg, and then we are going to put our item type as file. Okay, perfect. So that should be good here. So now if we rerun this entire thing, we now see that we have our configuration file that's created. We got our output. Everything seems fine. If I run it again, on the other hand, we still get our error message that appears. So we can actually fix that very soon. But we know that we have all the things currently working, so that's great. Now let's add some more parameters. Let's go ahead and let's add a parameter here. So we're going to add another parameter by adding the comma, and we're going to add a parameter. And this time, this parameter is not going to be mandatory. So we're just going to leave that blank. And what we want to do is we want to take in a version number, the version of the configuration. So we're going to, again, accept a string, and we're going to set that to a version. And what we want is, since it's not mandatory, we're going to put a default value, and our default value is just going to be 1.0.0. Now what this is going to do is, if you don't put any version name, it's just going to go ahead and use the 1.0.0. If you do pass in a version name, it will use the version that you pass into it. So let's go ahead and let's add an array output with version of version here. And then what we could also do is, in our item here, is we can actually do a version. Let's pipe that out to out file, and let's do a file path. And what we need to do is we're going to have to take our file path now, and this is where it gets kind of messy if we don't have parameters. We have to put our name.cfg here. And let's just wrap this in a variable wrapper just to make sure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have our force. All right, so let's actually go ahead and let's see what happens with this. All right, so we see that we still get an error, and that is from the new item. If we go in here though, by chance, we do see our version number. So we were able to add something to our configuration file, and that seems to have worked just fine. Now, if we do another create config and we do a version, and let's put our version here as 1.0.1. And let's go ahead and let's run that here. We are going to see that it does overwrite it. So maybe you would want to put something in your code that would prevent that from overwriting, but let's actually keep going here. We're just starting out with the real basics to this function. So what we want to do now is also set up what operating system that this configuration file could be for. Or actually, before we do that, let's actually take in the path, because we know that we have multiple times that we actually reference a path here. So we should actually probably replace that with a parameter, give the user the ability to pick out that file path. So let's go ahead, let's create a new parameter. Now I would make this a mandatory parameter because the user should be passing in where they want to store their configuration files. Once again, this is going to be a string and we're going to call it path. And then all we're going to do is we're actually going to change all these values here for path. Okay, so that should be okay. So now that we have all of this here, now if we actually go ahead and we're just going to do our config path right above our create configuration, and we can do a path and we can actually put in our config path. So now if we actually go ahead and do a number 2, we will see that now we have our test config 2 and we are using our actual path value. If I put a 1 here, we're going to see that we actually get errors because the path configs 1 does not exist. So we know that it is using our new config path for our create configuration. All right, so the next thing, so actually this should be fine, but we're going to add one more. I just want to show you guys what a validate set is for a parameter. So let's actually go ahead, let's create a new parameter here. And I'm going to make this one not mandatory. We're going to assign it a default value, however. But what we also want to do, so we're going to take in a string and we're going to name this operating system. And we are going to call it Windows by default. But let's say we only want the option for Windows or Linux in our script because we can't handle anything else. For some reason, that's the only 2 systems we can actually operate. We left out OS X maybe our company doesn't use OS X, so we don't want to give that as an option. So we're going to actually go ahead and above where you assign the parameter name and right below the parameter, what you do is another set of square brackets here. And we're going to add a validate set, open and close parentheses. And then in here, you would actually create your options. So here I'm going to put Linux and Windows. So now if we go ahead and we actually run all of this here, and I come in here, and I do another dash, we're going to see operating system. If I do a space, it actually pre-populates our 2 options. Now let's say I want to say Mac OS X. If I actually run this, we will actually get an error, and our error is cannot validate argument on parameter operating system. The argument Mac OS X does not belong to the set Linux Windows specified by the validate set attribute. Supply an argument that is in the set and then try the command again. So here, if we actually go ahead and we change this here to Linux and we just run this, we get that the file already exists. So let's actually go ahead and let's do a test config 3 here. And there's our config 3 with our version. We're not currently storing the operating system, so that is a-okay. So let's actually go ahead and let's just do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this line here. We're just going to paste it once more. And instead of storing the version, we're going to store the operating system. And what we're going to say is actually we're going to do an append. And we are going to do a force here. And that should be good. So now if we do a test config 3, we go look at it, we also get that it is Linux now in our configuration file. So let's go ahead and let's delete all of these. Just so we start off with an empty option here. So let me just go over what we've done so far. So we've created a function, and in our function now we have 4 parameters. We take in a name, we take in a version, we take in a path for where we want to put the configuration, and we take in an operating system. And then what we're doing is we are creating a configuration file for that configuration. We're putting it in the path that the user supplied, and we're creating the configuration with the name passed in, and the details inside is the version of the configuration and the operating system. So now what we would want to do is we've seen commandlets be used through the pipe. Like we've seen the get service, we can pipe that to start service, and it'll start all the services that we pull from the get service. Or we can create an array of names of services and then pipe that to the get service, and it will get us all those services and tell us the status. So let's actually go ahead and let's see if that works for our own commandlet here. So let's go and let's create a names array. We're going to put in 3 names here. So we're going to put in test config 1, test config 2, test config 3. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do names, and we're going to pipe that to create configuration. And let's say that the path is going to be the config path. And since the operating system and versions aren't mandatory, we're not going to do anything with those. And let's just see what happens. Now, as we're going to see, we get prompted for a name, which is kind of weird because we're passing the names through. It should be taking it in. Now, by default, even if we have the commandlet binding and parameters, it does not accept any items from the pipeline. We actually have to tell our method that it can accept items from the pipeline. So let's go ahead and let's put that in here. So we're going to go back into our parameters here. And for the name parameter, what we're going to want to do is right beside mandatory, we're going to put a comma, and we're going to put value from pipeline. And then once we have the value from pipeline, what we can actually do is we can actually go ahead. So here I'm creating a test config 1 just with the commandlet. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating 3 config files. So let's see what actually happens. Okay, so we get the first 0 configuration, and then it seems like once we passed in our array, we piped it to create configuration, but out of the 1, 2, and 3, only 3 got created. Now you might be wondering why, because we said value from pipeline, and this is actually because we're missing 3 critical parts in our function. In PowerShell, there's actually 3 blocks that are very, very important inside of a function to make it work like you would expect to, especially if you are accepting items from a pipeline, and that is the begin block, the process block, and the end block. So let's go ahead and let's actually just first go over the process block, and then I'm going to go over the begin and the end block afterwards. So if we actually come back to our function up here, and right around all of our, pretty much our algorithm or our steps that we want to do, let's go ahead and let's wrap that in a process block. So we're going to write process and open curly bracket, and then we're going to close it with a closing curly bracket. Now, if we actually go ahead and we actually run this now, we get our other configuration files. We get errors because 3 and 0 already existed, but we actually created 1 and 2. So if we actually delete all of these once again, let's delete these and let's run these, we get all the configuration files back. Everything is working as expected, which is great. And then the other blocks is the begin block. So let's do a begin, open and close parentheses. And all we're going to do here is we're just going to do a write output, and we're just going to write out begin block. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to do our end, open and close parentheses, and we're going to do a write output, end block. And what we're going to do is we're just going to delete these configuration files just to avoid the errors from happening for now. So once we actually go ahead and we create that here, let's just delete this here, and let's just do it with our array. So if we actually run this whole thing, oops, I should actually delete these. I must not have actually deleted them here. Delete permanently. All right, so let's go ahead and let's run this. So here we have it. It created our free configuration files. And here we get begin block, and that only happens once. And then we get the creating configs, and then we have the end block only once. So every time that you run a function, it will come in, it will accept values from the pipeline because we have value from pipeline here for the name. It will come in through the begin block once. So this would typically be to set up any variables like counter variables, or maybe a database connection that you want to be open while your process block is running. So again, the begin block is for setting up basically your environment for the actual process to go through. So database connections or counters, anything like that. Your process block will be your main job. So that is where all the actions are taking place. Maybe you're executing commands against the database. Maybe you're creating files, like in this case, creating users in Active Directory or something. And then your end block will be maybe displaying the totals from the counters and closing your database connections if you have any. That is what your end block would be, because your end block always runs. As we notice, if we run this again, even though there's errors, our end block still runs. So as we've seen with like a try catch finally, where our finally block is where we would use to close off the database connections. If you're using it in a function, you could just close off your database connections in the end block. It will always run. It'll close that connection for you. So now what we can actually do is use these begin and these end blocks to see maybe how many of our files got created successfully. So again, this is where kind of everything just kind of meshes in together. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go and create two counter variables. So we're going to create one called counter passed and counter failed as 0. So they're both at 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap so we have our process here. So let's wrap our process here in some try statements. So a full try statement here. And then we're going to have a catch. And then so we're going to be trying to write the output. We're going to be creating our configuration. We're going to be creating the new item. We're going to be pumping that to the file. Now, if anything happens, what we're going to be doing is we're going to do a write output, and we're just going to write out the $_.exception.message just to display the message of the error that would actually have appeared. And then what we want to do is we actually want, after all the things in the try statement are passed, what we want to do is do a counter passed ++. Now we'll automatically increase our counter passed by 1. If we go in the catch statement, we're going to want to counter failed ++. And then we have our end block. And then what we want to do in the end block here is let's do a write output configurations created is going to be counter passed, and then we're going to then just do a comma configurations failed counter failed. Okay, and that should be it here. And now if we actually go ahead and we run this now, in our first one, counter passed and counter failed. So as we can see here, now this is actually something that we learned in our try catch. We still get the 3 configurations were created successfully, even though there were actual errors here. Now this actually shouldn't have happened, but that is because we did a try catch and the new item is not a actual stop error action by default. So what we need to do is add a parameter here for error action. And we're going to want to make sure that that is actually set to stop. And if we go ahead and we run this now, we will get our errors message successfully like displayed, which is not like the bleeding red text throughout the screen. And we get our configurations created is 0, configurations failed is 3. So now if we actually go ahead and we add a configuration here, test config 4, and we run this now, we will actually get configurations created as 1, configurations failed as 3. Now, maybe you don't necessarily want these to fail. Maybe you'll try to create it if it doesn't exist. If it does already exist, maybe you just want to like update the configuration with the new items that you're passing in. That is completely something that you could do for sure. So that is definitely something to keep in mind there. And now the only other thing left here for the functions is to show you guys how the debug and the verbose works. So if we actually go ahead and we do this here, we can do verbose, we will actually see that nothing really different happens. And that is because we are only using the write output. So what we should actually do here, instead of doing a write output, we can do a write verbose. Verbose basically is telling the user what is going on. So really explaining to the user what's going on at the time, what step is it at. Not necessarily used for debugging or anything like that, but really our configurations created should still be a write output because we should want that even if we're not running it verbosely. Maybe we do want it only when we're running it verbosely, but in my case, I want it to appear every time. So we're going to keep that as write output. But maybe we don't want to know that it's in the end block unless we're running it in verbose. We don't really want to know that what configuration you're creating was what version number. We don't really care about that. So this is where we would put our verbose. And then if we actually go ahead and we run this now, as you can see, we now get our begin block in verbose. We get our verbose creating configuration for test config 1. And if we don't run this, we will see that now we get very limited view, but if we again put verbose back in, we will actually see our items here. Now the other one is debug. Now as you probably guessed it, debug is just going to be for write debug. So what we could do here is in our process block, after our try catch, we can say write debug, and we can say counter passed. So maybe configurations created, because maybe we want to keep track of the configurations created. Maybe we're seeing that our numbers aren't necessarily correct. So let's do configurations created, configurations failed. And we could do a counter pass and failed here. And then what we could do is we can also run it with debug. So if we run it with verbose and debug, we will see that we can actually see our increments in the configurations failed, configurations created. We get the debug wording, the verbose wording. So this is just things that you can add to your commandlet. So if someone maybe doesn't really necessarily know exactly what's going on or why it's failing, you can add these verbose and debug statements so they can run the commandlet or the function with those parameters, and maybe they can understand a little bit more of what's going on, why it's not working, or give you the ability to troubleshoot your functions a lot easier this way. Now, there are a bunch more with functions that I will be going over. Like right now, we've only done value from pipeline. but this video is already super long. I don't want to overdo the information. I want you guys to practice these functions and this level of just accepting values from the pipeline. The other options, as you probably saw, if we do another comma here and we do value from pipeline by property name, so this will actually let you pass objects in, which if they match the property name, they will instantly take it in. So this you could easily put for every single parameter, and you can actually pass in objects that have name, version, path, and operating system, and it will automatically create those configurations. So maybe if you guys want to try that, you guys can try that. I will be covering that in the next video. So we're going a little bit more in depth with our method creation compared to the last tutorial series, but I do think it's very important to cover creating commandlets and creating methods a lot, because this is really what you guys are going to be creating, especially once we start going into modules and creating our own modules. Modules are going to be just a bunch of functions, a bunch of commandlets that you're creating. So I think it's very, very useful to actually get this knowledge very well down pat before you go into those. If you guys have any questions or comments for me based on this video, please let me know in the comment section down below. I will do my best to answer you. If it's something specific, if it's something a little bit more generic and general, I will try to make a video on it. This way it can help the mass population of people that are watching these videos. Once again, I thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that notification bell to be notified when that next video comes out. I will see you guys in the next video.